Consciousness theorist Anthony Peake seems the ideal biographer to shed new light on the life and inner life of Philip K. Dick, a novelist preoccupied by the question, what is reality, and who claimed to have had experiences beyond normal understandings. A Life of Philip K. Dick, The Man Who Remembered the Future, is his sixth book, with previous works including The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, and, more recently, The Infinite Minefield, The Quest to Find the Gateway to Higher Consciousness. I started my interview with Anthony by asking what drew him to the topic, and why he tackled it with what he terms his idiosyncratic approach.
Well, I suppose because everybody else, or the biographies of Philip K. Dick that had gone before me, had very much just taken effectively a chronological viewpoint of Phil's life, and they had also probably the Carrera book is a classic example where they'd fictionalized large sections of Phil's life, whereas what I wanted to do was to get into the man's head. I wanted to understand literally what made him tick. Because his psychology is as interesting as his novels and his life itself. And I also wanted to understand in greater detail whether the events that he described took place as he described them to be. In other words, the famous 2374 events in which he claimed that, well, we would argue his Daemon manifest and such like. And this is why I approached it the way I did. I was also interested in discussing the influences on him in greater detail and the subsequent influences he's had on other writers and indeed other artists. I mean, I was surprised to discover, for instance, that a guy called Todd Mackover has actually written an opera based upon Valis.
Yeah, I just read that, yeah.
Yeah, so that there's a lot of Phil's influences were incredible. Somebody else I was in regular contact with when I was writing the book is the guy responsible for writing a kind of a Marvel comic based upon one of Phil's stories, The Electric Ant. You know, which again was quite fascinating. You know, and how he had worked this particular storyline, weaved it in a typical kind of Marvel comics type way, because Phil very much lends himself to that.
Yeah. So nobody had positioned him in literature before in that way?
Not particularly. He has. There have been some very, very deep analysis of Phil's literature, almost to the extent of being so deep as to actually miss the point of Phil's writing. You know, the postmodernists love Philip K. Dick, and there's particularly the French postmodernists. And having read virtually all of these books, you know, I find that sometimes, and I know that Nick Buchanan is of the same opinion on this, that Phil would have really hated the way in which his novels have been taken apart by the intellectuals, and every single line and every single set of circumstances have been analysed to death. So no, people have analysed the novels, but you know, for me, not as many people have actually gone back and said, well, you know, Phil was fascinated by, for argument's sake, clutching something out of the existentialist psychiatry. You know, and in his novels, he wove in a lot of the existentialist psychology into there and psychiatry into his novels. And I wanted to understand how he'd first come across these ideas, how they panned through, how they changed over time, this kind of thing.
So with that, I mean, with the existential psychology, for example, where did he come across those ideas? Who were the thinkers that he was reading?
Well, he became quite fascinated with the idea of what exactly reality is, you know, and how we perceive reality and whether we perceive it subjectively or not. And he was particularly, I'm trying to actually find any references here that I have on this. It's a guy called Ludwig Binswanger. Okay. And Phil became fascinated by the whole idea of what is reality and what isn't reality. It spun out from his interest in the split brain operations of Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, which I touch upon in both the Daemon and Is There Life After Death. And Phil himself became quite interested in the idea that if you cut the corpus callosum of somebody's brain, you effectively end up with two personalities.
So any idea biographically as to why he was so interested in this idea of the split personality? I know he had a twin that died just after they were born.
Yeah, Jane died around about 2 or 3 months after Phil was born, and he always claimed that Jane was within him. And for instance, in some of his novels, you will have the theme of the twins and the twin growing inside another twin. And you'll also get the themes as well of duality. Also, the female characters sometimes seem to be very much based upon Jane and the loss of Jane. Indeed, this is probably one of the reasons why he became so fascinated with the Gnostic concept of Sophia. Again, because he very much considered that Jane was some form of character and Sophia and was part of his life. But it's interesting, this story about twins, when you're a twin and you lose your twin at a very early age, because my father was an identical twin and his brother died at around about 6 months old. And my father, I felt, was profoundly influenced. His life was very much influenced by the idea that part of him was dead. And he felt that there would have been somebody that could have shared a life with him very closely. Even though he was one of 8 children, he still felt that his dead twin would have been the person he could have related to in greater detail. And to a certain extent, Phil felt this as well. In fact, some analysts have said that Phil's philandering and womanizing and his sometimes inability to actually deal with relationships with women was part of his relationship with Jane, his mental relationship with Jane. But for Phil, the whole existentialist psychiatry thing was very much the idea of his belief that he himself was two personalities. You know, that there wasn't one Philip K. Dick, there were two. And indeed, you don't even have to closely read his book Valis to realise this, because in Valis he has two characters. He has Phil Dick, the science fiction writer, who's very rationalist and very, very grounded, and he has this crazed character called Horselover Fat. Now, Horselover Fat, again, is one of Phil's very, very clever linguistic puns, because horse lover, if you say horse lover in Greek, you get Phil Hippus. And of course, Dick and fat, Dick is German for fat. So horse lover fat is in fact Philip Dick. So again, we have the scenario of two characters, both of whom in the book you're never quite sure if they're reflections of the same character or not. And of course, he carries that through, you know, in A Scanner Darkly, you have the two characters in A Scanner Darkly as well, both of which seem to be reflections of each other. So Phil was very interested in this. But on top of this, what really fascinated Phil about the whole existentialist movement was also the work of Martin Heidegger. And, you know, the concept of Dasein, you know, being there, we are in this place. And Binswanger and his associates were intrigued by how certain individuals who had forms of schizophrenia believed they were trapped in the tomb world, you know, a world that isn't real and everything. And this again was what Phil really genuinely believed, that this reality we live within is an illusion. And, you know, you can see behind the illusion and see the reality behind the reality.
So when did he reach that conclusion? Was it early on in his writing career? Or is it something that he finally came to later on?
That's a fascinating.
Was it bit by bit?
It's a fascinating question, Martin, because one of the approaches I take in the book is that I do quite an ITLADian analysis of Phil. It's gentle, it's not in your face ITLADian, but I very much suggest that from a very early age that Phil's Daemon had manifest itself as part of his everyday personality and imposed itself upon him throughout his life. So in which case there's an argument to say that a part of him had always been aware of the future things that he was going to encounter. And again in the book it's really quite curious in that Phil many, many times had stated that his earlier novels were based upon events that happened later in his life, which is incredibly curious in that he believes that he was drawing up his inspiration from future memory. And time again this happens in his books, and he himself sometimes is stunned by the way in which he will write a set of circumstances. I think it was in A Scanner Darkly, for instance, he has a character of a young girl who is a junkie, whose boyfriend, she has a boyfriend who is involved in the drug trade, but she also has a relationship with a police officer. And he wrote this in A Scanner Darkly, only to, around about 6 or 7 months later, have a sort of quasi-platonic friendship with a young woman. And one day he's on his way, she and Phil are on their way into a restaurant. And as they walk into the restaurant, she says, I can't go in there because my other boyfriend is in there who's a police officer. So here we have again, a set of circumstances that Phil had written in an earlier novel. He also had a set of circumstances in an encounter. In one of his novels, he has an encounter between a black man and a white guy at a petrol station. And he then finds, a few years later, he goes to a petrol station late at night, and he again finds himself living through his own novel. And again, this is because he came to the idea that time is circular, that memories are circular, and such like. Most of this information, if anybody's interested, and it's well worth reading if you really want to get into Phil's mind, is his exegesis. And
so this was the 1,000,000-word sort of late night diary he would write to try and get to the bottom of his strange experiences of 74. Is that right?
Yes, it is, and it's an incredible read. It's an incredible read if you're an ITLADian. It is an amazing read if you're an ITLADian because you were already prepared to see what Phil was desperately trying to put together. Now, the exegesis is a huge work, and it was written on scraps of paper. Sometimes it was typed, sometimes it was handwritten, sometimes it had notes in the margin. And I would suggest if anybody wants to read it, you can't just read it page by page because it would drive you crazy. What you need to do is to probably get it on Kindle, and then you can search certain themes and carry certain themes through. But in there, it really gives depth to Phil's worldview. And I think I'm right in saying that I'm the first biographer of Phil who has written a biography of Phil post-publication of the full exegesis. So I have been in the advantageous position of being able to analyse it in a way that his life that others have not been able to. For instance, one of the most fascinating sections of the book comes towards the end when I discover that Phil had long believed that he had been either abducted by aliens when he was a child or when he was younger, and indeed had been encountering aliens through his life, and also that his DNA had been manipulated with.
So that's all in the exegesis?
It's in the exegesis, but it is also, you will find sections, it's really uncanny, in the Exegesis, because there are sections where he has hand drawings, and there are a series of drawings of these, what he considers to be Valis or AI, the thing that was communicating with him.
So there was a physical or visual representation of Valis.
Yeah, he did a drawing. He did a series of drawings of these beings.
So first of all, what is or was Valis in Dick's eyes? He wrote a book called Valis, didn't he? But what was it?
He wrote a series of books based upon the Valis principle. There's Valis the book, but there's also
Transmigration of Timothy Archer.
To an extent, the Transmigration of Timothy Archer touches upon it, but I'm more thinking of the Divine Invasion, and the what's the other one? The one that's just recently been made into a movie.
Radio Free
Albemuth. And all those books effectively tell the same story. To a certain extent, they tell the same story. And Valis was something that was communicating to him, that started to manipulate his mind. And he had a series of, in February, March of 1974, he had a series of really weird events where he felt he was being communicated with from somewhere else. Now, initially he concluded that the communications were coming from a geostationary satellite out in space, and it was beaming down information to him.
Based on the fact that he saw a pink beam.
Yeah, the pink beam effect is the general story goes. Now, I'll take it back to the general story because this gets to the root of my feelings about Phil as a person. If you read most of the stories of Phil and all the biographies and most of the articles, they will say that what happened was that Phil was sitting listening to the Beatles' Strawberry Fields, the record. And as he was doing so, a pink beam came from nowhere and hit him in his pineal gland, or wherever he would like to describe it as being, and a voice in his head, or not a voice in his head, he heard the Beatles singing in harmony, singing somewhere in the lines of, your son has an undiagnosed birth defect, he has an undescended, or he has an inguinal hernia. And this was so powerful that he came out of the room he was in and went to Tessa and said, Tessa, we have to get Christopher, which was their son, who was around about 18 months old at the time. Well, he was actually younger than that, actually. He was about a year old. That we have to get him to the doctors immediately. And Phil then tells the tale that Tessa and him then rush off to see the doctor. And the doctor immediately diagnoses this birth defect. And Christopher is rushed to hospital, and it's touch and go for a time, and the operation is successful, and Christopher survives. And Phil argues that the voice in his head told him that this was the case. This is not what happened, categorically, because I've interviewed Tessa on this, who was the only witness to these events. The reason being, and I go into a fair degree of detail about this, because Tessa was very helpful in giving me the layout of the apartment they were living in at that time, in the time of the incident of the pink beam. And apparently Phil's record player, they only had, I think, about 3 or 4 rooms in there. And there was a living room area, a kitchen area, and 2 bedrooms. And Phil's hi-fi system that he carried with him throughout his life was in the living room. On that day in question, Phil was in the bedroom, asleep. Tessa was out making milk for Christopher, and Phil was asleep. Phil suddenly comes out of the bedroom and announces that there's something wrong with Christopher. He wasn't listening to the Beatles because he couldn't be, because the hi-fi system was not in the bedroom. So that's the first story that is incorrect. Phil then says that they rushed off in the car to the doctors. They didn't. They did nothing. Tessa was aware that there was going to be a problem with Christopher anyway, because there was a congenital problem that one of her brothers, or possibly two of her brothers, had, which was similar. Now, Phil also argues that he knew nothing about these kind of hernias. Also incorrect. Phil, when he was in his second marriage with Cleo, was playing tennis in the early 50s, I suppose, and he twisted himself and had a hernia. And he'd read up all he could about these forms of hernias years before. So for him to claim that he didn't know about it is either he had forgotten, or more accurately, that he pretended that he'd forgotten. Okay? Now, again, if you read the letters, what is very intriguing about Christopher's illness is Phil doesn't mention it in any of the letters at that time. The reason being that Christopher's operation didn't take place till a year later. In other words, there was no immediate operation. They had to delay until Christopher was 18 months old in order for him to be old enough to have the operation. And indeed, chronologically, this fits in very well, because one of the most famous incidents in Phil's life was the famous Rolling Stones interview that he did. And this had been delayed for some time because of Christopher's operation, which again, I can date, happened around about 18 months later. So Phil's story of this is untrue. And the other much cited story is the original pink beam. And you will read again, and in fact, in the Robert Crumb comic of Phil's religious experiences, I think it's called The Religious Experience of Philip K. Dick, it describes this in detail. And again, it didn't happen as described. The story goes that Phil had an operation for a wisdom tooth, and he'd been in extreme pain, and he'd come home having the wisdom tooth extracted, and he'd been given sodium pentothal to numb the pain. And while he was recovering from this and still having relapses, they phoned up, Tessa and Phil phoned up so that they could have a delivery of more painkillers. And when the delivery was made, Phil's story is that he opens the door, he sensed something important was going to happen. He opens the door, and there's a young woman standing in front of him. And the young woman had round her neck the ichthus, the Christian symbol of the fish, round her neck, a chain round her neck. And he looked at this chain, and suddenly a pink beam came out of the chain and enlightened him. And he realized that he and the young girl were actually members of a secret Christian cult. And in reality, that we were all living in stuck in time. And in fact, the Roman Empire never ended. And, you know, we were all around about 45 or 70 AD, depending upon the days, on the years that Phil cited. And that time had stopped. Okay? Now, this is what he claims. Tessa's version is that she hears Phil coming downstairs, and they both go to the door, and there's the young woman there. Phil is looking at her, and he's looking at her breasts. Tessa spots him looking at her breasts and gives him a dirty look. Phil suddenly stops looking at the girl's breasts and makes out that he was looking at the symbol around her neck. Okay? What then happened was that Phil turned round, and apparently a few months before, Tessa and Phil had bought a series of Christian stickers, sort of transparencies that you could have on your car, okay, that you put in the window. And Phil turned round, and as he did so, the setting sun in one of the rooms that you could see from the front door was the sun was coming through it. And that's what Phil misinterpreted as being the pink beam. It was actually the sun hitting a sort of coloured piece of material. Now, so very, very different story. Well, sort of different, but somewhat embroidered. Now, what then happened is intriguing, because Phil then claims that he had what he called his Kandinsky experience, where he started seeing hundreds and hundreds of pictures, paintings, abstracts, semi-abstracts, things like Paul Klee, Kandinsky, various other sort of abstract painters. Now, Phil was convinced that what was happening here was that the Russians were beaming into his head images from the Hermitage in Leningrad, as then was, and St. Petersburg as is now. And he felt there was some kind of message. Now, I believe that this was a classic migraine aura.
So just a sec. So these images, does he actually say he likens them to the works of Paul Klee? He actually mentions Paul Klee
and mentions Kandinsky. Yeah,
Kandinsky. That's interesting. I've seen similar images, sort of abstract, like Paul Klee. Not possibly Kandinsky. I'm not sure. After smoking pot when I was younger,
mm-hmm.
I saw these things arrive in my mind. These very intriguing abstracts, which seem to have significance. You know, they seem to mean something, even though they obviously didn't, to my mind. So it's interesting that he mentions Klee.
I think that this phenomenon is intriguing, because what I think is happening is it's obviously brain imagery. But of course, you know that my point of view of just because I say it's hallucination doesn't mean that I'm actually dismissing it as being something not real. Because to me, an hallucination is evidence of something that is going on, that's deeper involved in some way. You know. Now, Phil.
But Phil himself, he didn't really reach any major conclusions. He would go round in circles about what all these things meant.
He would. I mean, that was the issue. He never came to a conclusion as to what was happening. And I think there is a famous line in Valis where the horse lover Fat character, you know, the Philip K. Dick character describes how horse lover Fat had a different explanation on different days, and it could be completely different. Now, Phil was the same as this, but what he was convinced was that something profound had happened. His issue was, what was the something profound? Now, I think, and in the book I present this, that I think this was the start of Phil's decline and his eventual terminal illness, because these migraine attacks that he was having at that time, I think actually suggest that he was suffering from what's called transitory ischemic attacks, which are micro strokes.
Strokes, yeah. Do you theorize whether the amphetamines had any role in this?
I don't know enough about the what amphetamines do to you, but I know that he was taking phenomenal amounts of amphetamine. He was also overdosing on vitamin C at the time. He'd read a paper which actually said that vitamin C could actually open up our abilities to see things. And he very much was overdosing at that time. So who knows what could have triggered it. There is also evidence that at that time he was also taking other forms of drugs as well. There is a great belief that Phil regularly took LSD. That really isn't the case. I can find probably about 3 times in his life he took LSD.
Which other drugs would he have been involved with? There was speed. Did he smoke pot?
I think he did once and he didn't like it. And there is another substance that he also took. I think he tried mescaline once and it didn't do a great deal to him. But the substance that I've checked up on that I think is intriguing is a substance called DOM. That's 2.5 dimethoxy-4-methylamphetamine. Okay? And I have evidence that on the evening of the 25th of February 1975, he took a fairly large dose of this. The reason being he was depressed because the following day was his daughter's Laura's 15th birthday, and he claims in one of his letters that he went next door and he got a hit of DOM, and then he took it in the loo, and It was no method.
So this is similar to LSD.
It's similar. It was an illegal drug. It was illegal at that time. Actually, it had been made illegal in September 1973. But again, looking at the chemical name of it, clearly it's a fairly strong hallucinogenic. Now, if that was the case, he took that on February 1975. There could be arguments to be saying that he could have been taking that earlier. Now, I discussed with Tessa whether she remembered that particular evening, and she did vaguely recall it, because Phil then said that he had that night a whole series of hypnagogic episodes. He saw math symbols and Greek letters, and he felt that somebody called Erasmus was talking to him. And Tessa did vaguely recall to me, and she said, yeah, I do vaguely recall Phil once describing Erasmus. So it could be that it was a mixture of all the events that he'd been taking in his past. Now, but in terms of the LSD, for instance, I know that, he took it fairly rarely. And when he did, he made great claims about it. For instance, he claimed that when he took LSD, while he was under LSD, he was speaking in perfect, grammatically correct Latin, and that he went back and he was either a Roman soldier or a Christian Roman soldier that was suffering because of his beliefs. Now, again, I've checked this out with one of his old friends who was the person with him. I think it would have been his second LSD trip, was with a fellow science fiction writer called Ray Nelson, who'd been a friend of Phil's for many, many years. And Phil claimed that he was speaking Latin and everything else. Now, I spoke to Ray about this. And I asked him, because Phil gives the impression that Ray would have understood perfectly grammatical Latin, because Ray was a Latin scholar. This is what Ray said to me. He said, I can't be sure Phil was speaking real Latin during his LSD experience. I wouldn't know the difference between real Latin and fake Latin. So that story that Phil was speaking in perfectly accented and perfectly grammatical Latin isn't true.
Well, nobody knows how it would be accented anyway, I believe.
That was going to be my point. Yeah. Effectively, how on earth does anybody know how the Romans spoke Latin? So
why is it not as rigorous, or as why does he lack veracity in these accounts?
Because Phil was continually redefining himself within his world. One of the things that if you spend the time reading his letters in detail, as I did, you will find that you catch him out in lie after lie after lie, and it gets worrying sometimes, because you think, oh my God, I've caught him out yet again. He will send one letter to one person and a letter to another person on the same day, telling completely different stories. And he does that again and again. So you have to take a lot of what he described with a slight pinch of salt. For instance, I'll give another example of this, and it's almost like researching the Bible when you start to actually look into the Bible line by line, the New Testament line by line, and you suddenly find it starts to fall apart. Because suddenly you see the detail, and suddenly the detail doesn't make sense. It only works when you're standing away from it. And Phil's life is a little bit like that, in that you look into the famous stories. I'll give another example: the famous Palmer Eldritch vision that Phil supposedly had. Well, didn't supposedly had, claimed he had when he was living in Point Reyes Station with his third wife, Anne. And in this, he describes how he was walking down the road towards his little. He used to hire a little place to write books, and he was walking down there, and suddenly he saw this huge vision in the sky, and the vision in the sky was of this huge gas mask thing looking down at him, which he subsequently then wrote a book called The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch.
Yeah, it was like a vision of evil, wasn't it? Like an overarching evil.
It was an overarching evil and horror that he saw in the sky. Now, there are a couple of things that spin off from this that I mentioned in the book. The first one is that when Phil was very young, his father had some of his equipment that he had kept from the First World War, and was showing Phil this. And one of the things he had was a gas mask, and his father put the gas mask on to show Phil the horrors of war. So clearly this image had imbued in his mind anyway, but he was old enough when this vision took place to remember it. So he'd already had a kind of an association with evil, with gas masks, things. But the other interesting thing is,
which a lot of people of that generation had something to do with gas masks, didn't they? Which came out as a sexual fetish for some of them as well.
Oh right, really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. And the smell of rubber, I suppose.
All kinds of things, yeah.
Well, the thing here again is that if you read Phil's version of the vision, then you read Anne Dick's version of the vision, because Anne wrote her own version of Phil's life, I think, called Remembering Philip K. Dick, I think it was called, and it's well worth reading because you see it from Anne's point of view. And in this, Phil was out gardening. He wasn't walking down the road towards the shack where he used to write. He literally was outside the front door gardening. And he suddenly comes in and he suddenly says, oh, I saw this incredible thing in the sky. So again, you have these conflicting stories.
But could this, just play devil's advocate for a sec, could this not be because you are now constructing, the surrounding events from other people's perspectives?
Yes, no, it is possible. But, you've got to take into account that extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs.
Right.
And if you claim that you diagnosed specifically that your son was dying of a hernia, and you specifically say that and repeat that many, many times, and then your wife says, well, actually, no, that didn't happen that way. And I know that doesn't happen because the dates don't work. So I know that definitely was. But suffice to say, he could have seen something in the sky. Now, the reason this is fascinating is Phil was redefining himself all the time. I mean, Tim Powers mentions this in one of his introductions to the letters, and Tim was a very close friend of Phil's. And, Tim and all the people that knew Phil, he was a fiction writer. He wrote fiction. And therefore, sometimes he had difficulty in telling the difference between the reality that was his external reality and the reality of his fiction.
Well, he was extremely prolific as well, wasn't he?
Oh, phenomenally so. Well, he had to be because, he lived from hand to mouth. I mean, it was only in the final 3 or 4 years of his life he made any kind of serious money out of his writing. It's very, very sad when you think The Man in the High Castle, he won the Hugo Award for that, and it looked like his life was going to change after that. But it didn't, because, of course, he then left Anne and then, sort of shacked up with Nancy, much younger woman. And then from Nancy then moved on to Tessa via various other relationships. It is clear that he was phenomenally charismatic. His charisma comes through. He is able to attract women, even though he seems to be very dependent upon them.
Do you think that he had, do you think he was just a little bit peculiar or eccentric, or do you think he actually would have what we would now say as a personality disorder?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Tessa very much says that Phil had dissociative personality disorder, as she defines it, multiple personality syndrome. And she said, that he could be different people at all times. He could switch from being one type of personality to the other. And this comes across in his letters and it comes across in his writings. But we're all like that. We all have different personas that we put forward. Phil was desperate to be accepted by people. I mean, the classic example of this is in his period in 1970-71 when he was down with the kids. There he was, a guy, sort of in his late 30s, early 40s. I think I've got the times right there, but he was actually living with the hippies, and of course had that incredible set of circumstances where there was a break-in in his apartment, and he claims somebody blew up his safe and stole all his documents and such like, and he was warned that dangerous people were after him, and he had to get out. And in fact, that's why he ended up for a time in Vancouver, to try and escape from the dangers. But even the break-in, the famed break-in, again, after talking to Ray Nelson, who again was a witness to these events, and Ray gave me some fascinating information. In fact, some of the information Ray gave me, I haven't actually written in the book because it's so contentious that I decided that I couldn't put that in the book. I mean, he named names. Ray gave me names of people and the name of the person he felt was responsible for the break-in. And after discussing it with Ray subsequently, I decided I wasn't going to put that in the book because this person...
So Ray Nelson also agrees with Phil that there was, he wasn't just being paranoid, that there was an agency out to get him.
No, not at all.
No.
What happened was, it seems from what Ray tells me and from reading other people's descriptions of events at that time, is that it was a drug deal that went wrong, and Phil had for a short period of time been dealing possibly in cocaine, and the safe itself contained cocaine. And Ray said that one day when he was with Phil, he could see Phil had the safe open, and he said he could see piles of white powder in there.
Do you want this to go into the podcast?
Yeah, no, it's fine. No, I put it in the book.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah. And that Ray believes that what happened was that the kids that were living in the house were aware of the fact that Phil had the cocaine in there, and it was an inside job, that they actually blew the door and took the cocaine from him and made it look as if there'd been some form of break-in.
Yeah.
Which is understandable within the circumstances.
This makes me think about A Scanner Darkly, and it's almost like that novel sort of confesses to his own untrustworthiness in terms of his accounts, because Scanner Darkly is all about these addicts and their different sense of reality, and then there's the investigating policeman who's an addict and he's investigating himself. So it's kind of almost like a literary confession to his own undependability on these stories.
Very much so. I mean, the whole A Scanner Darkly is absolutely based upon his time at that particular house at that particular time. And indeed, most of the characters in A Scanner Darkly can be traced back to absolute, real individuals that he knew at that time. For instance, the opening sequence of A Scanner Darkly, where the guy is he feels he's got bugs all over him and he's trying to get rid of them, actually was an event that took place. The discussions that the three characters have on how to make drugs and everything else, again, were discussions that Phil had with his associates at that time. So clearly Phil was in a strange place at that time, and he needed to escape from it. And in many ways, Tessa, or to a certain extent, Tessa and a lady called Linda Levy was the person that brought him round from this. In fact, again, Linda is somebody I've been in contact with, and it was fascinating. I was delighted when Linda responded to my attempts to contact her. And she will have, all the characters that I've mentioned, all the people I've been in contact with, Tim Powers was very, very helpful, Ray Nelson, they'll all have copies of the book now that's gone out for review. And Linda was the famous quotation that Phil made. She was destiny in a miniskirt, because she was one of the students with Tim Powers that met him when he came back from Vancouver back to California. And she said he was there, looked like some form of tramp. His trousers were being held up by a piece of string, and he was clutching a Bible. And so Phil's impression was called as this young girl, I really fancy her, whereas hers was, God, who's this old man? Now, the other things that you have to be aware about Phil is that he had been violent. He definitely beat up Linda Levy. And I'm sure at times he probably was at least physically and mentally abusive towards Tessa, and Tessa was a very vulnerable young girl, very much in love with Phil, and I don't think she had an easy time of it by any stretch of the imagination. Anne tells the story of the time that he threatened her with a gun, and he came running out of the house and was wielding a gun and was threatening to shoot her. So another time he suggested that they'd left a party and he'd been drinking, and he drove the car slightly off a hillside, and it was actually half on the hill, half off into the valley, and it was sort of swinging a little bit like in the ITLADian Job. Yeah. And he turned round to Anne and whispered in her ear and said, "Let's get in the car and end it." So he was profoundly complex.
So what would be your conclusion on his visions and his neurology? What is the connection there?
I think that he had opened up channels of communication within his brain, and I think he had done this because of either the substances he'd taken, maybe the overdoses of vitamin C, maybe the taking the DOM and various other things. But ultimately, I think that he had a series of extraordinary experiences. I found time and time again in the book where he was precognitive. There is no doubt in my mind that Phil did see his own future. And in fact, the final, the most powerful evidence of this is the letter he wrote to a lady called Claudia Krentz-Busch. And again, Claudia was very, very helpful to me in the sense that she also responded to my emails and gave me some interesting information. But towards the end in one of his letters, he describes how he had a series of hypnagogic images, they're kind of the liminal time when you're asleep and awake. And while he was in this state, in the letter, he says that he demanded that the creature, his Daemon, Valis, AI, whatever we like to call it, to manifest itself, which it did. But he then describes how he then saw in absolute detail the body of a portly middle-aged man lying face down between a coffee table and a settee. And he then writes, handwritten underneath, it says, "Claudia, I think I'm becoming precognitive." Okay? Now, when Phil died, the circumstances of Phil's death were quite curious in the sense that the reason that people were concerned was Tim Powers and his friends used to have a weekly meeting, just to have a few drinks and a discussion, and Phil used to attend. And one particular evening, Phil didn't turn up. And they became quite worried, and the next day they went round to Phil's house. And again, I've spoken to Tim directly or via email on exactly what Tim saw when the door was opened. And Phil was lying face down between a coffee table and the settee. His letter from a few years before had actually described in absolute detail his own death. Now, again, many people, you will hear reports saying that Phil never regained consciousness and that was it. He went into a deep coma and didn't regain consciousness. It's not what Tessa tells me. Tessa tells me he did regain consciousness when she went to see him. The first time he was looking at her, his eyes were moving, and he was definitely taking in what was around him, which must have been awful. And then the next time she went to see him, he'd gone into a very, very deep coma. But effectively, that was a classic example of his precognitions.
And had anybody else discovered this before you found it in the letter? You found this description?
I thought I was the first person that had spotted this, and if you read the Daemon, the last chapter of the Daemon, I have a section on Philip K. Dick, and I thought I was the first person that spotted this, but Tim Powers himself had many, many years ago, and came to the set, but he's the only other person.
Yeah. And he was the one that discovered Phil.
Yeah. He was Phil's close friend. Again, he'd been Phil's friend for many, many years.
It's kind of amazing that someone that he sort of in the way that he was not always exactly truthful, and maybe took away from some of his claims, that in death there's some kind of proof that he was seeing some kind of visions, he was going beyond time in the usual sense?
Oh, totally. I think that's if you read the exegesis, you will find there a man who these notes. Remember, the thing about the exegesis is Phil never intended them to be published. They weren't written for publication. They were written purely for a man trying to come to terms with the extraordinary events he was experiencing. So not for 1 minute do I question the events that took place. What I was just questioning was the way in which he subsequently presented them. The events did take place, of that I have no doubt. And, he's wrestling with so many issues and so many ghosts in this. But on top of that, there's this whole thing I touched upon earlier on about the alien abduction thing, because the drawings of the faces of the entities that he called AI or Valis, they're greys.
Really?
There's no question. They have pointed chins and bald heads and everything else. And later in his life, he wrote a short story called The Eye of the Sibyl, and in this it describes these creatures in detail. These creatures again had ossified third eyes as well, which he describes in detail. There was also a series of curious events that took place, which in ufology terms would have been incidents where he'd encountered men in black or MIBs. Men in black limousines driving round. It happened to him when he was in Vancouver. And this was a memory that he suddenly started to remember, a forgotten memory, that after his 2374, he started to remember things that he'd forgotten, and one of them was being driven round. Now, another friend of mine, Brad Steiger, who is an American writer and was a friend of Phil's, and again, I've been recently in touch with Brad about this, is that Brad interviewed Phil for a magazine, for a book he was writing. And although he doesn't identify Phil by name, Brad has told me and has mentioned to other people as well that this is Phil, that Phil believed he was an alien entity. He had beliefs that his DNA was alien in some way. And he had memories of being somewhere else in another planet and in another place. So again, we have some fascinating backgrounds to the man. And again, it was him trying to come to terms and understanding the true nature of what had happened to him. And towards the end of his life, he became absolutely preoccupied with the pineal gland, which again is fascinating for me because, as you know, my other book, The Infinite Minefield, deals with the pineal gland. And here we have Philip K. Dick being fascinated by it as well. So there's a lot here.
It all hooks up. It all connects, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, in amazing ways. I mean, the one thing, again, although as a person, I found sometimes difficulties with him, as a thinker and as somebody, as an intelligence and as somebody who was self-taught, it was an absolute polymath. I've been swapping emails with a guy called William Sarrell. And Bill Sarrell and Phil worked together on the theology of one of Phil's stories. I think it was Cosmic Pot Healer. I think something like this. One of his stories where he creates a new religion. And Phil in that writes about Zoroastrianism. He writes about the Kabbalah. All these things he put into his books and into his novels for them just to be considered to be just science fiction. And they're not science fiction. As Ursula Le Guin said, he is America's homegrown Borges. And in many ways, the similarity between Philip K. Dick and Borges is powerful. The only thing is that Borges was just a much better technician at writing than Phil was. But if Borges had had Phil's ideas, if we could have had an amalgamation of Philip K. Borges, it would have been probably the greatest writer the world had ever seen.
Well, do you think that in a way he's achieving success now that so many films are made based on his novels, or do you think they're too diluted compared to how he presented the ideas in the novels?
They are too diluted. I find I am really looking forward to seeing probably the second of the movies based on Phil's work that seems to have at least got the idea of it. A Scanner Darkly, the Linklater Scanner Darkly, was a good attempt at trying to get inside the mind of Philip K. Dick. But John Allen Simon, and again, I'm name dropping here, but John and I have been in contact regularly now, and we've spent a long time chatting on Skype. John is a film producer in America, and he's just brought out, produced and written a movie based upon the Radio Free Albemuth book. And one of the lead roles in there is played by Alanis Morissette, the Canadian singer-songwriter. And what John has tried to do desperately here is to get Phil's book really getting into what Phil was writing about. And I think from what I've seen of it, he manages to do this successfully. I think in many ways, for instance, if you read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and then you watch Blade Runner, there is very little comparison there, really. Blade Runner is a phenomenal movie. Let's state this categorically. It's a wonderful movie. And Phil, towards the end of his life, never actually saw the movie. He saw a screening of a trailer for it, which I think is an ultimate tragedy. But what he said about the movie was he saw that fantastic opening sequence where they're flying over the city and there's all the plumes of fire and they flying towards the corporation.
The Tyrell Corporation building.
Tyrell Corporation. And funnily enough, one of the things he said was that he really felt that they had got Rachel absolutely spot on, Sean Young. And he said, it is exactly how I imagine Rachel being. So to a certain extent, yes, there were the powerful images and everything else and the ideas that run through it. But in many ways, the deep philosophy, the empathy, for instance, in the movie, they really don't discuss the concept of mercerism, the religion where you flagellate yourself, and they all watch these empathy boxes and they watch this TV program where this old man is trying to climb up a hillside and people are lobbing rocks at him and they feel his pain. That whole thing was lost within the movie. And of course, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? The whole concept of the electric sheep is completely missed in the movie because it's the idea of all animals have died out or there are very few allowed, and in which case all you really want for a status symbol is a real sheep that you can have on your roof that will be grazing rather than an electric sheep. All that was missed, that joke on consumerism. Yeah. But it's still a great movie, but it's not a Philip K. Dick movie.
No, it's philosophically narrow compared to the novel.
Yeah, and Minority Report. The fact that the character in Minority Report that Tom Cruise takes off as a quasi-superhero was one of Phil's typical little men characters, the working man, the journeyman who's in a world that it's out of control and his wife hates him and he really isn't a success. That was Phil's characters. They were always nagged by their wives. They had a bad time of it,
Yeah, but Hollywood doesn't like to present those characters, does it really?
No, it doesn't. They have to be heroes. And maybe one hopes that with John's movie, that the central character in Radio Free Albemuth, the Philip K. Dick character, central character in that, will come across as a far more vulnerable, lost individual, which I think is the power of Phil's writing. I think in many ways of all his books, because I read all of them, all the novels as part of my research, I think his most powerful is The Transmigration of Timothy Archer.
Not sure I've read that one.
Well, what's intriguing about Timothy Archer, it's the only book he wrote from a female viewpoint, because the central character is a lady, and that is the account. And again, I have a large section on this in the book of Phil's relationship with Bishop James Peake, who was the Episcopalian Archbishop of California. And he was a close friend of Phil's, and it was Peake that introduced Phil to John Allegro and the idea of the Essenes and the sacred mushroom and everything else. And in fact, Peake, intriguingly enough, Phil and his wife, his fourth wife, actually went along with James Pike to a series of sessions with mediums, seances, which is interesting again, little known that Phil actually attended seances.
Yeah.
Because James Pike was trying to get in contact with his son, who had committed suicide. So Phil and Nancy went along. And that's a very interesting period of Phil's life. You know, it's again an area I focus in on because not many people touch upon it. You know.
Just a few more points before we wrap up. He theorised that at one point he had activated his right hemisphere. I think I read. Did you listen to the last podcast I did with Tony Wright, who's got this theory about that the human brain has been in decline since about 200,000 years ago, and that the left brain has become dominant as a result?
No, I haven't, and I will listen to that in the car tomorrow. I'll download it and listen to it. I'm aware of the work of Tony Wright, and it's interesting. You know, the idea that, you know, that we suffer from the fact that we are too left, the domination of the left hemisphere. And again, this touches upon the Daemon and the Daemon Eidolon dyad.
Yeah, absolutely. But did you find anything about Phil talking about?
Yes, very much so. He has whole sections on, because this is where I touched upon earlier on about the work of Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry on split brain operations. It was after reading that Phil became preoccupied with the whole idea of the split brains. And in fact, he became very interested in the work of Julian Jaynes, the bicameral mind. So this was very central to him. And I think this is because he was bicameral himself. And again, in support of Tessa's hypothesis that he was suffering from multiple personality syndrome, I believe that the amount of times you have characters in Phil's novels that are effectively split personalities. You know, again, Scanner Darkly is the classic of that, you know, where you have Arcta and the police officer, Fred. And, you know, they're two different personalities, but they're the same person. They're aspects of the same person. Philip K. Dick, the character Phil Dick, and Horse Lover Fat. Now, interestingly enough, I was intrigued to discover that Phil denied that the Horse Lover Fat character was him in Valis to Ursula Le Guin. In a series of letters, he was quite emphatic that it wasn't him. And yet, on the same day, he'd write a letter to somebody else and turn around and say, "Oh, yeah, definitely, that's definitely me," you know. Which was, again, is this part of his split personality? Was the letters themselves evidence of his split personality? Which is an interesting point, isn't it?
Yeah. And the other thing I want to ask you about is with Valis. It's the acronym is a vast, active, living, intelligent system. Sort of outside of human brains, but able to penetrate them. Was Valis thought of, or this thing in real life that corroborated to Valis, was that a non-corporeal collection of or cloud of intelligence? Because it makes me think, if so, it makes me think of the theory of the Orchard theory of Stuart Hameroff. Who also, I think you know this better than me, but he posits a similar sort of non-corporeal informational field sort of abroad in the universe. Is there any correlation there?
Whether Phil went that far, I'm not sure. One of the things I draw this a little bit together, and interestingly enough, in my new book, the Infinite Minefield, I very much extrapolate from the Penrose Hamerhoff Orcoar hypothesis and spin that out into the Akashic field, Akashic record work of Irving Laszlo, and suggest that there is a field of information, again to use a David Bohm terminology here, that this information is external to us, but it is us. In other words, we exist within a physical body. And I know that Phil was very fascinated with the idea of embodiment and being within a body and trapped within a body. because, as you know, he was, and of course we haven't really touched upon this, the Gnostic aspects of Phil's writing, and how right through his writing you have this Gnosticism and this idea that we are a shard of the pleroma, the world behind the world that's trapped within the corporal body. Indeed, in his books on Zoroastrian, that touch upon Zoroastrianism, he touches upon this as well, and the idea that we are trapped in a physical body. In which case, he would have suggested that Valis and the communications from Valis is from Neverwen and from elsewhere, that's not part of this space-time continuum, I suppose, to coin a phrase. But it's intriguing. I am always fascinated as to where Phil would have gone had he not tragically died so young, and where he would have taken his writings, or whether his brain was so badly fried that he wouldn't be able to have continued and functioned as an effective writer in the way we would have known and loved. I read a lot about some of the later interviews he did, and it makes interesting reading. Scott Appel did a book which his title escapes me at the moment, but in this it's a series of interviews that Phil did with this guy, and towards the end of his life. And again, it is interesting how it is interesting about him there. I think, I would like to believe he was on the road to recovery, and that with Tessa's help, because Tessa claims they were about to get back together again, and with Christopher being a young boy at that time, it would have been interesting as to whether that would have been Phil's saviour, that he would have grown up looking after Christopher and writing those novels that we feel we've been denied because Phil didn't live long enough to write them. Finally, what I'd just like to say is to give my absolute thanks to everybody that assisted me in the writing of this book, but specifically Nick Buchanan, because without Nick's help, the book would not have got across first base. Nick has an encyclopedic knowledge of Philip K. Dick, but not only that, he has probably the most extensive library of Philip K. Dick books you can imagine. I had to purchase a lot of the books myself, but Nick was so helpful because a lot of the books are so difficult to get hold of now, and Nick had them. So thanks very much to Nick for this. As a fellow Weralian, a fellow ITLADian, and a fellow dickhead, I give him my thanks.